Christophe Ollari, and I've designed a few years ago a global macro, multi-currency, multi-asset class research. And this after roughly 20 years of trading in banks and hedge funds. I think that just even before looking at the details of the ECB package, I think what is very important is a year ago, the ECB announced the end of the QE program. So we are 1 year later, and we are just about to see the resumption of the APP. So it just means, it just shows how much the global macro and the European outlook has deteriorated in 12 months. So I think it's a very strong message. The objective was to start some kind of normalization, and we are exactly back to where we were a year ago. So about the package, I think that there is two ways to look at it. It's very high expectations mid-August after some comments of ECB member Rennes, where the market starting to price an extremely aggressive package. So compared to what was priced in 3 weeks ago, it was to some extent disappointing. But we had over the last 10 days all the ECB hawks on the wires, and I think that market repriced their expectations. And compared to the expectations prior to the meeting, I think we were roughly in line because we had the 10 bips cut and markets were pricing 16 just ahead of the meeting. We had 20 billion of asset purchase. I think that market was expecting between 20 and 25, so it's roughly in line. And we had the tiering plus the more advantageous TLTRO terms. So I would say that the package in itself is good. The big difference is, I think that, and I mentioned it in the last few days, it's the key focus was on the forward rate guidance, and I think that in total that part was extremely dovish because not only the end of the QE program plus any hike will be contingent to inflation back to target at 2%, but staying anchored around 2% for a sustainable period of time. So which is quite a very aggressive way to say, you know what, our accommodation will remain in place for quite a lot of time, especially considering that they revised lower their inflation forecast, especially for 2020, which has been revised down from 1.4 to 1%. And for 2021, we are at 1.5%. So you can assume that, according to their projections, we're going to have QE for a few years. So this is the good part. Then, so you can assume that to some extent, they opened the bazooka box. But when you look at in the details, there are some early questions, and I'm wondering to some extent if it's not the Pandora box. Why? Because first of all, we learned very quickly that there was no consensus, and you can already see that dissenters are becoming vocal. This morning, ECB member Knot acknowledged that there was no need for QE, there was no need for such an aggressive package, and that the European outlook was not in a state requiring such an aggressive accommodation. I think it was quite surprising for me to see that influential members like Kerr and Villeroy joined the anti-QE camp. And then we have that question asked yesterday to Draghi, asking if they discuss about the change of the capital keys. And he mentioned that they didn't, which is in itself not a big problem because we are still a year and a bit away from, the end of the collateral pool. But it means that what looks Q infinity will be questioned relatively soon by the hawk members, saying, why should we extend? We don't have any more pool. So you see that there is a fracture within the ECB. And maybe the bottom line of yesterday was, it was not a ECB package, maybe it was more like a Draghi package. Or it was not an ECB package, it was a peripheric member package. And the issue is the question is, we had Draghi for so many years, and he put his print on the ECB monetary policy. What happened when Draghi lived? Is there a life beyond Draghi? Like, is there a life beyond Merkel? So in fact, it's more question marks about what's going to happen when Draghi leaves and when Lagarde step in. In fact, it's a way to limit limit for each country the amount of bonds you can buy. And the question will be, if there is no more collateral available, they will need to push it to 50% to be able to buy more government bonds, and especially from Germany. To a certain extent, I agree with the comments of Knut this morning. They're unlikely to achieve much. And if we can learn something from the last 4 years, it's in terms of real inflation, in terms of real GDP, QE and negative interest rates didn't achieve much. So I think that what they are trying to do is something very important. It's keeping very loose financial conditions. And secondly, I think that the idea underneath is to keep all the term structure of the European bonds as low as possible, to give very easy funding conditions for the European governments. So I think it's more like, okay, it's a bridge between the monetary policy and the fiscal policy to incentivize the governments to push on the fiscal expansion pedal. I think we reach at least temporarily, we reach the peak of stress and pricing of the Armageddon scenario mid-August. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that we've seen the lows in yield, especially in Europe. So from now on, I don't see much interest or focus on those nominal curves. And I think that by telling everyone rates are going to stay low for a prolonged period of time, and that we're going to do QE for the foreseeable future, it becomes more like a carry trade. And I imagine that there will be a lot of interest on banking credit, for example, where you still can pick up some carry. My view is that the big move has happened already on the European yields, and I don't see more juice there. I think that Europe is in quite a worrying global outlook. It's got quite a worrying global outlook. Compared to 2017 and today, we see that GDP has more than half. Inflation has more than half as well. And everybody's trying to explain that one of the key catalysts for the deterioration of the European outlook is, in fact, the trade war between the US and China. Again, we tend to forget that the reversal of the European growth didn't happen in 2018, but happened at the end of 2017, which was, in fact, a consequence of the change of model growth by Beijing early 2017. And you have the usual, transmission mechanism between China on one side and its credit growth and the very open economies, starting with Germany and Europe. So in fact, the European malaise started well before the trade war. It started early 2017. So which means that the fate of the European growth is not in Frankfurt, is not in the hands of the ECB. I think the fate of the European growth, as usual, will be in Beijing and its ability and willingness to shift again into a more old growth model. It will be dictated by Washington and the US administration willingness to pause the trade conflict or not. And I think it will be dictated essentially by Berlin and the ability and willingness from Berlin and the German government to finally put in a cupboard their obsolete fiscal rectitude. So just like a very quick word on the BOJ. I think that what happened on the ECB side has no implication at all on the BOJ. I think the BOJ has made clear that, but first of all, it has made clear that they were very focused on the exchange rate. We know that the break-even level for the Japanese exporters is around 107. So at 108, 108.20, I don't think that the BOJ is in any urge to do anything. Also, last week we had the Japan monetary base, the year-on-year expansion, and we went down to 2.3%, which I think is, nobody talked a lot about it, but which is very worrying because we are exactly back to the level pre-QE. So in fact, it just means that they have increased the balance sheet up to 100% of the GDP. They have injected trillions of liquidity. The liquidity didn't, the cash didn't go anywhere. So I think that the BOJ has already reached the limits of the monetary policy impulse. And when Draghi said, he really insisted on the need of fiscal expansion in Europe. And I think it was a clear acknowledgement that in Europe as well, the monetary policy stimulus has reached its limits already. So again, preserving the loose financial conditions, giving the conditions for the governments to use their budget surplus and implement proper fiscal expansion. But in itself, it's not going to change anything for inflation and growth in Europe. I still think that the Fed is going to do 25. It's very rare to see a 100% cut or 95% cut a few days before the FOMC, and the FOMC decided not to deliver. The question is not on Wednesday. The question is, okay, what next? My guess is the Fed is still not ready to do much more, and I think it's going to be very contingent to the data. I insisted a lot in the past on the fact that the Fed is has been already co-opted by the political sphere, and you can see that if the ECB has shown some fracture yesterday and in the previous days, the Fed is fractured as well, and there is dissenters who are not ready to potentially, even if they don't talk about it, to give a free ride to Trump ahead of the elections. And I think that there is a very strong political aspect in the FOMC. So they're going to do 25. And I think that the risk is for a very, at best, neutral message. You know, the hawks at the Fed, they can just keep on repeating unemployment rate at 3.7%, growth around 2%, inflation. They're not going to use the core PC, but they're going to use the CPI, saying we are back to 2.4%. Average hourly earnings at 3.2%. I think that retail sales today were, again, on the strong side. I think that you're going to have dissenters, and you're going to have people who will question, do we need to do much more than another 25? We have reached a very important point yesterday or tomorrow, next Wednesday. I think that for 2019, unless the macro outlook deteriorates much further, I think we have seen the end of the easing wave of the central banks. We had a lot of impulse given by the EM banks, central banks. I think that the ECB is done for now, unless you have a dramatic deterioration. And I think the Fed will do 25 and maybe just not wait and see, but data dependent. So we have reached that big wave of impulse. In that context, I think it's very difficult to see the dollar dramatically collapse or correct. It's only if you have slowly but surely an inflection of the data, which is so far too early to predict. Again, I'm going to go back to Draghi because yesterday he said something that I thought was very interesting. He said that one of the first tasks of Lagarde, and in some kind of brainstorming project, will be to question the relevance of the inflation target. Personally, I don't think that it's relevant anymore, and because in fact, what is the point to have an inflation target at 2% when you undershoot all the time, and it can have a reverse, psychological effect, and you can see it in Japan. People know that 2% will never be reached, so it's like an illusion. The problem is, what do you put instead? You put 1% to be sure that you are fulfilling your mandate, but this is an illusion as well. Or do you put 4% just to show people that, to create some, some like inflationary momentum? I doubt it will work neither. So I think that the inflation target is illusionary and obsolete, but I still don't know, to be honest, with the current monetary policy framework, how we can reach those targets. And I think the answer is maybe in the ability to create new economic approach, which will in time potentially boost the real inflation and not only inflate financial assets. I think that this will be the debate of the next few years. And I am massively convinced that QE, low interest rates, have only been strong catalyst to boost financial assets. And what has the ECB done yesterday is another episode of financial QE. Financial QE will not bring anything except it maybe fuel even more the anger and the resentment toward the elites, toward the central banks, toward the banking system in general. I know that MMT has become a big subject and attract a lot of stigma. It's a Ponzi scheme, it's a scam. I believe that it's not about do we like MMT or don't we like MMT. I think that it's more like the concern and what is underneath, which is important. What is important is there is a global need from voters to get a bigger share of the pie, and the pie tend to reduce. So it's all about redistribution. So I think that political candidates will integrate some part of MMT, which in fact already exists. What Donald Trump is asking for spending and the Fed resuming QE to basically transfer the public debt, which is in a banking balance sheet, into a public balance sheet, the Fed balance sheet. And what is doing the BOJ and the AB? They are doing MMT to some extent. They put the rates at zero, everything is worth zero, and they are just spending, and the BOJ is funding the fiscal stimulus. So even if we don't call it MMT, it's already in place. What the ECB is telling everyone yesterday, it was like, we're going to do more QE, but you have to spend. Even if they don't want to call it, social QE, they are calling for that. They want to move away from the financial QE into a social QE. And the only one problem is going to take time. But I think that it's a debate, but I think it's for me, this is the obvious journey we are going toward. Do you remember the big dream of Bernanke when he implemented the first round of QE? He was like, okay, we're going to put a lot of cash in the system. It's going to inflate equity market, for example. And then those positive effects will slowly spill over into the real economy. So that was a beautiful dream. It never happened. And this is what I basically call financial QE. It's like, okay, we have created a gigantic financial asset bubble, but in reality, excepted a very 10% part of the population, nobody benefited from it. So what will be, I think you have different steps and in the social QE. The first step is what I think the ECB is trying to put is like, we are buying your debt, spend into infrastructure or basically corporate tax cut or income tax cut. So that's the first step. And I think that first step, the central banks will be very keen to do. But I think there is a more extreme step where you will end up with the government and the central banks working very close together, where in fact the central banks will only be facilitating the spending of the government and warehouse the debt in a public balance sheet. The gloves are on between the ECB and the European government. Between the ECB and Germany. I think that the message of Draghi, in many, many years, I follow Draghi very carefully, and I never saw him so adamant about the need from the countries who are in budget surplus to finally spend and spend in size. So he was pointing, obviously, the German government. So I think that fiscal expansion in Europe is highly dependent on the ability of Germany to finally put their fiscal rectitude on the side. I think that without Germany, it's going to be extremely difficult for Europe to have a meaningful fiscal expansion. Is Germany ready to do it? Unfortunately, I think that it's still not there. I think that when they are talking about the ability to do something like 50 billion if the economy goes into recession, they will be in technical recession in Q3. 50 billion is nothing. And 50 billion is not enough. Does it mean as well that if they go out of recession, they will stop the fiscal expansion? So I think that it's not a structural move. They might do it very temporary, but we are very far away from a European, global, broad-based and sizable fiscal expansion. And I think that this will be the main task of Lagarde. I still think that Germany will be extremely reluctant to go that way. I think that it's going to be in time inflationary. The problem we had when you look at the budget deficits in Europe from 2014 until 2018 is the trend is amazing. In fact, all the European governments have deleveraged and reduced their deficits, and 4 of them are in surplus now. So what does it mean? It means that for 4 years, which is the period when, in fact, Draghi started QE, they use the monetary stimulus to create fiscal austerity. So there is no way that inflation could have been created because, in fact, the money which was there has been taken away on the other side. So I think that if you have a mix between monetary policy accommodation and fiscal expansion, you will finally have some maybe better chance to create real inflation. I think that the best news for Europe right now will be a rollover of the data in Germany further. And I think that it's the more bleak the situation and the outlook for Germany look, and maybe the more the German government will be ready to finally cross the Rubicon and become a more, I would say, in sync with the real needs of the economy. If the data improves in Germany and Europe more globally, I think that you are starting to have a big problem because the hawks at the ECB will start to be vocal, just calling for the end of the QE. And Germany will just very quick to acknowledge that they don't need to do any fiscal expansion. And that's when you end up with this outlook for Europe, which will be extremely shallow growth and undershooting inflation. I think that the strong message from yesterday was like, it's not necessarily Q infinity, but it is a last message. We do that, but you have to do your part as well. And I think that Draghi insisting on the fact that governments need to take the baton because they can't save the European economy is in fact the reality. They have run monetary policy stimulus has run its course and will be very ineffective in terms of inflation or real growth if the governments decide to keep on their fiscal austerity path. So far, 2019 has been extremely spectacular and very mind-blowing. I think that we reach, in August, a peak of stress, a peak of Armageddon scenario, which has been amplified by technical factors, and especially negative convexity hedging flows. We are right now on all the asset classes back on very pivotal level, and the next 3 months will be dictated by the ability of Beijing and President Trump to maybe pause and to bring back some wisdom that is well required after quite a lunatic August.